Last video, we talked about motivations for exploration. Just sum them up as God, gold, and glory, national or personal glory, and power, of course. Today, I want to talk about one of the earliest, most established colonial powers in Europe, Portugal. They were the first to really go out and explore and establish themselves in the world. Portugal was separated from the rest of Europe by land because its only border was with Spain. It was on the coast in the ocean. Additionally, it had convenient access to the Atlantic Ocean, enabling naval expeditions. Due to its location on European sea lanes, particularly between Italy and Northern Europe, Portuguese harbors were important ports of calls for fleets moving between Italy and Northern Europe, which was where the main trade was in the region. This also enabled Portuguese sailors to gain a great deal of knowledge from other travelers that they could use in their own exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator. Good name to know. Prince Henry the Navigator, son of John I, King of Portugal, began Portuguese exploration. Wow, Prince Henry the Navigator began Portuguese exploration. What an important historical figure. Henry initially fought the Muslims in northern Africa. He built a fleet to attack the Muslims in Quetta and successfully took the city. However, conquering the land also showed Henry that there was a great wealth in Africa, leading him to dream of exploration and conquest. Through this contact, Henry became enamored with the idea of gaining control of valuable trade routes in Africa and searched for ways to gain direct access and control to gold, silver, spices, and other luxury goods in Africa. However, his father would not give him permission to wage a crusade directly in Africa, so he set off to discover another way to control African trade. Exploration became his main interest. Henry initially set out to explore the coast of Africa and traveled to Azores. However, he decided that he would create a support system for widespread navigation and exploration rather than explore himself. Henry built a navigational school at Sagres in 1419 that supported and trained explorers, an explorer's school. He brought in the map makers for the most current world maps and sought out the finest and most technologically advanced equipment. Prince Henry sought to expand profitable trade routes along the coast of Africa and into the Indian Ocean that would benefit Portugal. In addition, as a strong religious man, he hoped to establish a Christian community along the coast of Africa to counter the impact of the Muslims. During the 1420s, the Portuguese began exploring the western coast of Africa under the leadership of Henry's navigational school. While they hoped to find a sea route to Asia, they also wanted to establish direct trade with Africa so that they could avoid having to use North African middlemen. As the Portuguese moved further along the African coast, Portugal began establishing trading posts. The Portuguese took advantage of these contacts and began trading for spices like pepper. They traded for gold and they traded for slaves. Of particular importance to them was the port of São Jorge de Mina, established in Ghana, known then as the Gold Coast. Portugal's involvement in the slave trade began as early as 1443, when Nuno Tristão purchased some slaves in Africa and took them back to be sold in Portugal. Within a few years, Portuguese slave traders had begun to seek ways to exploit the African continent for their own gain. In 1452, the Pope issued a papal bull making it acceptable for Europeans to enslave people considered infidels or pagans. The Portuguese used this papal declaration to justify their actions in Africa. A local slave trade already existed within the African continent long before the Europeans ever came. People in Africa were traditionally enslaved for several reasons. Individuals could be enslaved by a family or group to settle a grievance. Criminals could be sold into slavery, and war captives could be forced into slavery. The Portuguese discovered the slave system in Africa and sought to exploit it for their own use. However, in African slave systems, those enslaved were not usually viewed as property, therefore ensuring them certain protections, while the Portuguese saw slaves as property. It's a big difference. Lucrative economic opportunities on sugar plantations prompted the Europeans to become deeply involved in slavery. Initially, the Portuguese sought to provide slaves for developing sugar plantations in the Mediterranean. Once the Americas had been discovered as another area that could support sugar plantations, the Portuguese sought to extend the slave trade there as well. Bartolomeu Dias. Dias was one of the explorers who had taken a trip down the coast of Africa on behalf of Portugal, and was the man that King John II of Portugal chose to search for a sea route to the Indian Ocean. Diaz set sail with two caravels and a supply ship and traveled along the entire western coast of Africa, reaching the tip of Africa and rounding the Cape in 1488. Diaz named it the Cape of Storms, although the King of Portugal later renamed it the Cape of Good Hope because it provided proof that a sea route to India exists. Once Diaz proved that such a route was possible, his crew essentially mutinied, demanding to return home. They forced Diaz to go back to Portugal, and he lost the opportunity to become the first European to travel to India completely by sea. Diaz never traveled to India, although he later helped da Gama build his fleet. In the end, Diaz accompanied Cabral into the Atlantic, but the ship he was commanding sank, and all its men, including Diaz, were lost. Exploration can be quite dangerous. Early Portuguese explorers used the western coast of Africa to help them establish trade ports and to navigate around the continent as they searched for a sea route to Asia. The Portuguese came to the Congo in order to secure trading rights. Initially, the Congo was open to the Portuguese, and trade and cultural exchange flourished. Many in the Congo even converted to Christianity. However, over time, the leadership of the Congo wanted to cut slave trade ties, something the Portuguese were not interested in doing. Consequently, The Portuguese conquered the Congo and then turned to find other groups along the western coast of Africa with whom they could trade. Along the eastern coast of Africa, Portuguese sought to control the lucrative gold trade in Zimbabwe and seized several cities like Sofala to increase their control. In Mozambique, the Portuguese were also drawn to gold. However, their plans were complicated by the fact that Muslim traders were still actively involved in the region. In addition, Africans did not intend to easily give up their gold. Consequently, the Portuguese got involved in internal African affairs in the hope of controlling more of the gold trade. They met with mixed results. Vasco da Gama. King Manuel I of Portugal sent Vasco da Gama to further explore the Indian Ocean. He began his journey on July 8th, 1498, with four ships and would ultimately land at the Malabar coast in southwest India. While trade along the western coast of Africa had been a challenge for the Europeans because the people and languages were unknown to them, arrival in the Indian Ocean brought the Europeans into a large, well organized trade network which they could access with translators. Da Gama traveled along the coast of West Africa and then around the Cape of Good Hope, or the Cape of Storms as Dias named it. He also explored parts of the eastern coast of Africa, including ports in modern day Kenya, and established a port on the island of Madagascar, along with various other ports. Da Gama ultimately made his way to India with the help of an Indian Muslim guide. Once there, he was able to engage in some limited trade and returned to Portugal, sparking additional voyages. Some of the things Da Gama traded with India were wool, clothing, bronze items, and a bit of gold. Although Portugal was not able to exert sole control over this sea route, it managed to become the first European country to sail it and set the stage for other European incursions into Asia and ultimately the New World. During the 16th century, the Portuguese Empire in Asia expanded and Lisbon became an important trading post, overshadowing other cities like Venice. Lisbon's the capital of Portugal. The Portuguese gained control of the Persian Gulf and established a profitable trade route with Arabia. The Portuguese also established trading ports in a variety of other places, including the East Indies, Java, Borneo, the Spice Islands, Macau, and Japan. In many of these places, Catholic missionaries, like Francis Xavier, accompanied the traders and helped spread Christianity. So you see, when the Portuguese trade, when European spreads, it's not just trading goods, but ideas too. The Portuguese attempted to improve their trading position in India by pitting native rulers against one another, and by sparking conflict between Muslims and Hindus in an effort to win control of trading posts like Calcutta and Gao. They introduced European ideas of government and attempted to eliminate customs they found immoral. In addition, Portuguese missionaries traveled to India and worked to convert their people to Christianity. Afonso de Albuquerque. The Portuguese aggressively worked to keep others out of the Indian Ocean trade. The person who oversaw this policy was Alfonso de Albuquerque. The strategy of de Albuquerque was quite simple. He took over important ports throughout the Indian Ocean, like Hormuz or Malacca, and then required that all traders secure a pass for trade in the ports. Without these passes, ships could be seized, and those on the ships could be physically punished, including mutilation and execution. Nevertheless, the vastness of the area they tried to control limited their ability to fully enforce the provisions that de Albuquerque had implemented. It was too easy to skirt the Portuguese ships, and both Muslim and European traders continued trading without securing trading passes. As a result, the Portuguese came to control only about half the spice trade in the Indian Ocean. Still quite profitable. The collapse of the Portuguese Empire. The Portuguese Empire in the Indian Ocean became very difficult to manage due to its large size. In addition, Portugal had few finished goods to make available to countries in the Far East, resulting in an uneven balance of trade. They were losing money on this trade. Spain's King Philip II seized control of Portugal, leaving its colonies in the Far East relatively weak and unprotected from either native resistance or incursions by other European powers like the Spanish. Japan began to resist Portuguese interaction with the country and expelled Christian missionaries and foreigners, including merchants and traders. Japan shut itself off. It lost those markets. And the English seized Portuguese trading interests in Persia and India. And the Dutch moved into areas of China and the Spice Islands. After regaining its independence from Spain in 1640, Portugal managed to win back some of its former territories, but it would never again be a dominant trading force in Asia. The discussions today about the rise and the fall of Portugal, and of course the importance of Henry the Navigator, who inspired all of Europe to go out and start getting territory.